At dawn, a drainage worker halted beside a cane-filled culvert, noticing winter fog lifting from pooled water, a purse snagged in reeds, and the calendar page frozen on December, while deputies measured silence, boot prints, and the slow certainty that someone had vanished into the cold Louisiana morning air. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The location sat just outside Houma, where narrow parish roads cut through sugarcane and drainage ditches ran dark after winter rain. It was December of 1985, a season when decorations already hung from porch rails and radio stations rotated familiar holiday songs, yet the call that reached the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's office carried none of that warmth. The missing woman's name was Rebecca Ann Landry, age 22, last seen 2 nights earlier after leaving a late shift at a small seafood packing plant near the bayou. Her car was found parked neatly at a gas station several miles away, doors locked, keys missing, no sign of struggle. The purse and the reeds matched the description given by her family, and the discovery shifted the case from concern to dread without spectacle or noise. Deputies documented the scene with the practiced restraint of the era, marking tire impressions softened by dew, collecting the purse, and noting the absence of blood or torn clothing. The cane field bordered a parish drainage canal maintained by the state, a place locals passed daily without a second glance. Rebecca's wallet was missing, but identification cards were later found inside the purse, along with a small spiral notebook containing work schedules and grocery lists. No note suggested intent to disappear. Weather records showed temperatures dipping into the 40s overnight, unusual enough for southern Louisiana to matter, especially for evidence preservation. The canal water moved slowly, fed by recent rains, and search teams began methodical sweeps downstream. Rebecca Landry had grown up in Houma, the daughter of a pipefitter and a school cafeteria worker, known for reliability and quiet humor. She was saving money for nursing classes at a community college and lived with a roommate in a modest duplex. Thanksgiving had passed weeks earlier, and she had spent it with family, photographed beside a folding table crowded with casseroles. Christmas plans were underway, gifts partially wrapped, schedules coordinated. The abrupt absence cut against routine, and investigators built a timeline from time cards, receipts, and witness statements gathered without flourish. On the night of December 9, Rebecca clocked out at 11:42 p.m. Coworkers recalled her fatigue and her intention to stop for fuel. A cashier at the gas station remembered a young woman matching her description purchasing cigarettes shortly after midnight. Surveillance cameras were rare then, and the station system was non-functional. Phone records showed a brief call placed from the station's payphone to Rebecca's home number, unanswered. That call became a pivot point. Detectives canvassed the area, logging vehicles seen idling nearby, noting a pickup with out-of-state plates reported by one witness, then downgraded due to inconsistencies. Searches along the canal continued for 3 days. On December 12, divers located Rebecca's body lodged against debris a mile downstream. The recovery was handled with procedural calm, the remains transported to the parish morgue. The autopsy revealed drowning as the cause of death, with blunt force trauma consistent with a fall or push, timing aligned with the night she vanished. No defensive wounds were documented. Toxicology was negative. The findings narrowed theories without providing a suspect, and the case settled into the quiet grind familiar to departments before digital databases reshaped investigations. Detectives examined associates, coworkers, and former acquaintances. A brief relationship earlier that year ended without reported threats. Employment records showed no disputes. The gas station vicinity produced no actionable leads. With Christmas approaching, media coverage remained local and restrained, emphasizing facts over speculation. Missing person flyers were replaced with memorial notices, and the Landry family endured holidays marked by absence rather than ritual. By January 1986, the file thickened with notes but not answers. Evidence was preserved according to standards of the time, sealed and logged. Hair samples recovered from the purse strap were inconclusive with available technology. A partial fingerprint lifted from the notebook could not be matched in state records. Investigators revisited the canal access points, noting a service road that connected to a private dock used by commercial fishermen. Interviews yielded nothing solid. The case went cold not through neglect, but through exhaustion of leads. Years passed. The parish changed slowly. Cane fields rotated, roads were widened, and younger deputies replaced retirees. Rebecca's case remained on a shelf, revisited periodically when new tips arrived, often prompted by anniversaries or holiday segments in the local paper. In 1999, evidence was re-examined when the state crime lab expanded DNA testing capabilities, but the samples were degraded. Results were partial and non-probative. The file returned to storage. The break came decades later, in 2019, when a regional cold case task force audited unsolved deaths from the 1980s. Advances in forensic genealogy offered a narrow path forward. The hair from the purse strap, once insufficient, now yielded a usable profile after careful extraction. With court approval and strict protocols, investigators compared the profile against public genetic databases, adhering to evolving legal standards. A familial match emerged, distant but promising, pointing toward a man who had lived in Terrebonne Parish in 1985 and later moved out of state. The name was Thomas Eugene Broussard, a dock laborer then in his early 30s, with minor arrests for theft but no violent convictions. Records placed him working near the service road by the canal during the winter of 1985. Interviews conducted in 2020 revealed inconsistencies about his movements that night. With consent, a DNA sample was obtained and matched the hair profile within accepted statistical thresholds. Additional corroboration followed. Time cards placed him off duty near midnight. A former co-worker recalled a heated exchange at the dock days before Rebecca vanished, a detail overlooked in earlier canvases. Detectives reconstructed the night with renewed clarity. The theory held that Rebecca's car was followed from the gas station. The canal access offered seclusion. The absence of defensive injuries aligned with surprise and proximity. The push into the water explained the autopsy findings without embellishment. Financial motive was supported by the missing wallet, later found discarded along a rural road, containing no cash. An arrest warrant was issued in November 2021. Broussard was taken into custody without incident in Texas, extradited to Louisiana, and charged with second-degree murder. The prosecution relied on the DNA evidence, the reconstructed timeline, and witness recollections tested against records. The defense challenged the age of the evidence and the reliability of memory, but pretrial hearings affirmed admissibility. In March 2023, after a bench trial, Broussard was convicted. The sentence reflected the gravity of the crime, and the years elapsed, imposing life imprisonment with parole eligibility under state law. The Landry family attended the proceedings, quiet and composed. Statements read into the record acknowledged the long wait and the measured relief of resolution. The parish marked the closure with a brief notice, factual and restrained. Christmas returned that year with familiar lights and songs, unchanged, while one file left the cold archives at last. The investigation did not pause with the recovery, and the weeks that followed moved forward under a gray winter sky that felt heavier than the humid summers locals were used to. Terrebonne Parish deputies worked through December with steady discipline, assembling Rebecca Ann Landry's final movements minute by minute. Gas receipts, payroll logs, and handwritten statements were aligned on long tables inside a sheriff's office conference room where Christmas decorations had been quietly removed out of respect. Every effort focused on routine verification, not theory, because the department understood that assumptions made early could distort everything that followed. Rebecca's vehicle examination revealed no damage and no foreign fingerprints of value. The interior showed normal wear, faint traces of seafood plant residue on the floor mats, and a radio preset to a local AM station known for holiday programming. Her apartment was undisturbed. Wrapped gifts sat beneath a small artificial tree, labeled for family members. Bank records showed modest balances and no unusual withdrawals. Phone records from the landline at her duplex indicated no incoming calls after she left for work. The absence of activity became its own data point, reinforcing that her night followed an ordinary pattern until it ended abruptly. Witness interviews expanded outward from the gas station. Deputies knocked on doors along parish roads where porch lights glowed early in winter evenings. Several residents reported hearing nothing unusual. One fisherman recalled a vehicle idling near the canal around midnight but could not describe it with certainty. Another witness believed she saw a woman walking alone near the station, but admitted the memory might be shaped by later news reports. Each statement was logged, evaluated, and weighed without elevation beyond its reliability. Media coverage remained careful. The local paper ran a short column describing the discovery and requesting information. Radio stations mentioned the case between weather updates and holiday announcements. There was no public pressure campaign, no televised appeals. The sheriff's office preferred restraint, knowing that overexposure could generate noise rather than clarity. Still, tips came in, most of them vague, some sincere, none decisive. The autopsy report guided investigative direction with quiet authority. Drowning, combined with blunt force trauma consistent with a fall, narrowed the field. There were no indicators of prolonged restraint, no evidence of sexual assault, and no substances that suggested incapacitation. This shaped the working theory toward opportunistic violence rather than planned abduction, but investigators kept alternative explanations alive, documenting each possibility with equal care. By January, the case file had grown thick with reports. Supervisors reviewed it line by line, searching for gaps. The canal access road became a focal point. It connected commercial docks, storage sheds, and a gravel turnaround rarely used after dark. Employment rosters from nearby facilities were collected. Names were cross-referenced with minor arrest records, traffic citations, and known associates. Nothing crossed the threshold required for arrest. As Mardi Gras season approached, attention shifted elsewhere in the parish, but detectives continued periodic reviews. Rebecca's family was briefed regularly, always with facts rather than promises. They were told the case remained open and active, even as leads thinned. That honesty built a quiet trust that would matter decades later. In the late 1980s, Terrebonne Parish adopted improved evidence storage procedures. Rebecca's file benefited from that transition. Physical items were recatalogued, sealed with updated labels, and logged into a centralized index. The purse, notebook, and clothing were preserved under controlled conditions. At the time, it was simply good practice. In retrospect, it became the reason the case could be revisited meaningfully. The 1990s brought incremental changes. Computerized records allowed faster searches, but forensic limits remained. Investigators revisited old names when new arrests occurred, checking alibis against revised timelines. Each time, the trail ended without confirmation. Rebecca's case appeared occasionally in anniversary articles, framed as unsolved and unresolved, but never sensationalized. It became part of the parish's institutional memory, referenced during training as an example of thorough work that still fell short. In 2018, a new sheriff authorized a comprehensive cold case audit. The goal was not publicity but accountability. Files from the 1980s were pulled, including Rebecca. Younger detectives, trained in modern forensic methods, read through yellowed reports with fresh eyes. They noted details that earlier teams could not act on, including preserved biological material previously considered unusable. The decision to pursue forensic genealogy followed months of legal review. Policies required judicial oversight and strict adherence to privacy standards. When approval was granted, the process moved slowly. Samples were retested, profiles refined, and comparisons made against public databases used voluntarily by participants. The first indication of a familial connection arrived quietly, flagged by analysts who emphasized caution over certainty. The surname that surfaced was familiar to longtime deputies. Thomas Eugene Broussard had worked docks and seasonal labor jobs in the mid-1980s. He was not prominent, not notorious, and had never been charged with violent crime. That ordinariness demanded rigor. Investigators reconstructed his employment history, confirmed addresses, and verified movements through archived payroll records and tax documents. Interviews conducted years later were methodical. Broussard spoke calmly, offering general recollections but few specifics. He acknowledged working near the canal but denied contact with Rebecca. When confronted with discrepancies between his statements and documented schedules, he adjusted timelines without explanation. None of this proved guilt, but it justified further inquiry. Consent for DNA collection was obtained under lawful conditions. The comparison yielded a strong match to the hair recovered from Rebecca's purse strap. Analysts calculated statistical probabilities consistent with courtroom standards. The evidence did not stand alone. Investigators sought corroboration through witness re-interviews, locating individuals who had since moved away. One former dock worker recalled Broussard's agitation around that period, including financial stress, and a missing paycheck later resolved through a cash advance. Reconstruction experts revisited the canal site, accounting for water flow rates documented in 1985. Their analysis supported the original time of death estimate and the downstream location of recovery. The physical environment aligned with a brief encounter rather than prolonged transport. Each finding tightened the narrative without overstating conclusions. By the time an arrest warrant was drafted, the case rested on multiple pillars rather than a single breakthrough. The warrant affidavit outlined the timeline, forensic evidence, witness statements, and investigative steps taken over decades. It emphasized continuity and preservation rather than sudden revelation. When Broussard was arrested in 2021, the community reaction was subdued but attentive. Local coverage noted the age of the case and the persistence behind its resolution. There were no declarations of closure yet, only acknowledgement that a long process had reached a critical stage. The courthouse prepared for proceedings that would revisit a winter night long past, guided not by emotion, but by records patiently kept and carefully examined. Pretrial proceedings unfolded slowly, shaped by the age of the evidence and the gravity of reopening a death long assumed unresolved. Motions focused on preservation standards from the mid-1980s, chain of custody documentation, and the scientific evolution that allowed degraded samples to speak decades later. The court reviewed laboratory protocols, storage logs, and testimony from analysts who explained how contemporary methods extracted probative value without altering original material. Each ruling narrowed uncertainty and reinforced that the case rested on procedure rather than novelty. The prosecution's timeline reconstructed December with disciplined restraint. Payroll records placed Rebecca Ann Landry leaving work shortly before midnight. The gas station receipt window, corroborated by the cashier's memory and inventory logs, fixed her presence there minutes later. The unanswered payphone call, traced through billing records, suggested a moment of hesitation or concern. From there, the route toward the canal access road aligned with traffic patterns typical of late shifts and minimal holiday congestion. Investigators emphasized ordinary choices leading into extraordinary consequence. Defense filings questioned memory reliability after decades, arguing that recollections risked contamination by later reporting. The court weighed those concerns against contemporaneous notes taken in 1985, preserved in ink and initialed by deputies. The distinction mattered. Where memories stood alone, they were treated cautiously. Where memories matched records, they gained weight. The approach reflected an understanding shared by jurists and investigators alike. That time erodes certainty, unless anchored to documents. Expert testimony addressed water dynamics in winter. Hydrology specialists reviewed rainfall data, canal maintenance schedules, and flow rates documented by the parish. Their analysis supported the original estimate that the body traveled downstream within hours, consistent with recovery location and condition. This finding reinforced the initial autopsy conclusions without revising them, demonstrating continuity between past assessment and present understanding. Community attention increased as trial dates approached. Coverage remained factual, often recalling the modest scale of the original investigation and the absence of spectacle. Older residents recognized names and places. Younger ones learned how routine settings could conceal unresolved harm. The tone stayed measured, reflecting respect for a process that avoided dramatization. Courthouse hallways filled quietly, not with protest or celebration, but with observation. During trial, the state presented evidence sequentially, emphasizing linkage rather than accumulation. The hair recovered from the purse strap was contextualized within handling records, storage conditions, and exclusion of secondary transfer. Analysts explained probability without embellishment, situating numbers within accepted forensic thresholds. The match to Thomas Eugene Broussard did not claim certainty alone. It connected him to an object associated with the final moments, at a place and time he acknowledged being near. Supplementary evidence addressed opportunity and motive. Employment records showed Broussard's proximity to the canal after his shift ended. Financial documents indicated strain during that period, including a short-term cash advance. The missing wallet, later recovered empty along a rural road, supported a theft element consistent with opportunistic violence. None of these facts were presented as definitive alone. Together, they formed a coherent pattern aligned with the physical findings. The defense emphasized absence of eyewitnesses and the lack of surveillance footage, realities of the era rather than investigative failure. The court acknowledged those gaps while noting that the law does not require perfect evidence, only proof beyond reasonable doubt assembled lawfully. The bench weighed demeanor, consistency, and corroboration, applying standards refined through decades of jurisprudence. Throughout proceedings, Rebecca Landry's life was described without sentimentality. Records showed a young woman balancing work and plans for education, engaged in family routines anchored by holidays. The presentation avoided narrative flourish, focusing instead on the interruption of an ordinary trajectory. This restraint underscored the loss without exploiting it, aligning with the documentary character of the case. Closing submissions returned to method. The prosecution outlined the preservation of evidence, the incremental advance of science, and the patience required to revisit conclusions responsibly. The defense reiterated concerns about time and memory. The court recessed to consider findings, reviewing transcripts and exhibits against statutory elements of the charge. The verdict arrived without ceremony. The court found that the evidence established guilt beyond reasonable doubt, citing the convergence of forensic linkage, opportunity, and corroborated records. The decision emphasized that the passage of time did not diminish accountability where proof remained intact and procedures honored. Sentencing followed statutory guidance, acknowledging both the seriousness of the offense and the elapsed years. Life imprisonment with parole eligibility reflected the law in effect, balancing punishment with procedural fairness. The judgment included recommendations for victim services notification and record updates to reflect resolution. The file that once occupied a shelf now bore a final disposition, its margins annotated with dates spanning nearly 4 decades. Afterward, the parish returned to routine. The canal access road remained, maintained as before. The gas station changed ownership, its payphone long removed. Seasonal rhythms continued, with Thanksgiving gatherings and Christmas lights marking time. For the Landry family, the outcome offered a measure of certainty rather than restoration. They issued no public statements beyond acknowledgement of the court's work. Law enforcement conducted a quiet review, identifying lessons in evidence preservation and intergenerational collaboration. Training materials incorporated the case to illustrate how restraint, documentation, and patience can carry value beyond immediate results. The cold case unit archived digital copies alongside original reports, ensuring accessibility for future oversight. In Houma, the story settled into local history, referenced without embellishment. It stood as a reminder that resolution may arrive long after the moment passes, guided by steady adherence to process. The winter of 1985 receded further into memory, but its unanswered questions no longer lingered. The community absorbed the outcome with composure, and the investigation closed not with triumph, but with the quiet finality of work completed according to law and record. The years following the conviction unfolded without spectacle, shaped by administrative steps and the subdued consequences that follow long-delayed justice. Court records were finalized, appeals deadlines noted, and the conviction entered into state databases that had not existed when the investigation began. Thomas Eugene Broussard was transferred to a Louisiana correctional facility, processed according to standard intake procedures, and assigned a classification reflecting both the seriousness of the offense and his age. There were no public statements from his family, no claims of miscarriage amplified in media, only the quiet mechanics of a system concluding its work. For the Landry family, the end of proceedings marked a transition rather than an end. Rebecca Ann Landry's name returned to official records with a resolved status, a change that carried emotional weight disproportionate to the simplicity of the notation. They visited the courthouse once more to retrieve personal effects released by order, items that had been preserved for evidentiary purposes and now returned as property rather than exhibits. The exchange occurred across a counter under fluorescent lights, handled by clerks who followed checklists and verified signatures. Holidays continued to arrive with regularity. Thanksgiving meals still gathered relatives around tables, and Christmas decorations still appeared along parish roads, but the tone subtly shifted. The long uncertainty that had defined previous seasons was replaced by a quieter reflection. There was no celebration attached to the outcome, only acknowledgement that questions no longer hovered unanswered. For relatives who had aged alongside the case, The resolution arrived as a confirmation that persistence mattered, even when progress was imperceptible. The sheriff's office conducted a formal closure review. Supervisors documented investigative milestones, cataloged evidence disposition, and ensured that archival materials were preserved for historical and legal reference. Training divisions incorporated anonymized lessons from the case into curricula emphasizing documentation standards, evidence storage, and interagency cooperation. The review did not assign blame to earlier investigators, recognizing the constraints of the period, but it underscored how disciplined process created future possibility. Local media marked the conclusion with brief follow-up articles. The language remained factual, referencing the conviction date, sentence, and the original discovery near the canal. Editorials avoided commentary, reflecting a community accustomed to restraint. Readers encountered the story as part of a broader landscape of parish news, adjacent to weather updates and municipal notices, reinforcing that justice, when achieved properly, integrates into civic life rather than dominating it. The physical locations tied to the case changed incrementally. The drainage canal was dredged as part of routine maintenance. The cane fields rotated through harvest cycles. The gas station lot was repaved, erasing surface traces that had once been measured and photographed. Yet records preserved those earlier states, allowing investigators to revisit them accurately decades later. The contrast between altered landscapes and stable documentation illustrated the importance of record keeping beyond immediate utility. Rebecca's grave, marked modestly, received visitors who stood without ceremony. Flowers appeared occasionally, placed by those who remembered her as a co-worker or classmate rather than a case. The marker listed her dates and name, nothing more. In that simplicity, the focus returned to her life rather than the manner of her death. The absence of spectacle honored the tone that had characterized the investigation from the beginning. Within the legal system, the case became a reference point during discussions of forensic genealogy. Prosecutors and defense attorneys cited it when debating standards and safeguards, noting how court oversight and corroboration preserved fairness. The case demonstrated that new methods could be applied to old evidence without compromising rights, provided that each step was transparent and reviewable. That balance became part of continuing education seminars, attended by practitioners across the state. Parole considerations remained years away, governed by statute rather than sentiment. Broussard's status entered a long phase defined by institutional routine. Annual reviews, program eligibility assessments, and health evaluations proceeded according to policy. The system treated him neither as an emblem nor an exception, reflecting an understanding that accountability does not require amplification. For investigators who had reopened the file, professional satisfaction was tempered by perspective. They recognized that the resolution did not restore what was lost, but it affirmed the value of patience and fidelity to process. Their careers continued, informed by the knowledge that outcomes may hinge on decisions made long before their involvement. The case reinforced an ethic of care applied equally to active and dormant files. The broader community absorbed the story into collective memory. Conversations referenced it occasionally, often framed around the idea that answers can arrive unexpectedly. The narrative did not morph into legend or cautionary tale. It remained grounded in specifics: a winter night, a canal road, a preserved purse, and decades of waiting. That grounding prevented distortion and preserved respect for those affected. As time moved forward, the holidays regained their ordinary rhythms. Decorations went up and came down. Traffic increased along parish roads during shopping seasons. The canal reflected winter skis and summer heat in equal measure. Life continued without adjustment to accommodate the resolved case, which is perhaps the most telling indicator of appropriate closure. Justice integrated rather than disrupted. The final administrative act involved sealing certain materials under standard retention schedules while keeping essential records accessible for oversight. Digital backups were verified, and physical evidence deemed no longer required was handled according to protocol. Each step was logged, initialed, and dated, echoing the same attention to detail that had preserved the possibility of resolution years earlier. In the end, the Louisiana 1985 cold case concluded not with revelation, but with confirmation. Confirmation that disciplined investigation, even when incomplete, can lay foundations for future answers. Confirmation that victims deserve accuracy rather than urgency. Confirmation that communities can confront past harm without sensationalism. The quiet aftermath reflected those principles, leaving behind a resolved record and a community that moved forward with the weight of certainty, replacing the burden of doubt.